like to thank the Literary Translators Association of Canada for their support in making this possible. I've been thinking and imagining this reading series for a long time, but could never find the means or the support to carry it out, because people really should get paid for what they do. And the concept of this series is to open a dialogue or a kind of space for readings, discussions, and performance of literature in translation. And the focus will be on world literature in translation, which is not as easily available in English. And there's so much of it, and it's so rich an area of the imagination. And it's time, I think, for this kind of pollination to happen, and I hope that this vehicle will facilitate that. It's kind of fitting that it's Luciano Iacobelli and Al Moritz who are here with me for this, because with Luciano, we have organized events like this one. In fact, we ran a reading series as a collective with Alan Breesmaster and John Calabro, which eventually became a literary publishing house called Quattro Books. And with Al Moritz, well, I've collaborated over my lifetime, really, as a writer. And in fact, it was he who helped me find the perfect title for this reading series. So without much ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight. Luciano Iacobelli is a Toronto-born poet, playwright, and visual artist. He has published many poetry books, including The Angel Notebook, The Book of Disorders, Painting Circles, The Examined Life, and Dolor Midnight. This is Dolor Midnight. It's his latest publication. And there is a book of his forthcoming titled Noctograms. He has been active in the literary community as a creative writing instructor, event organizer, editor, and significantly as the founder and former publisher of Quattro Books. And he is also the publisher of Lyrical Miracle Books, a press that specializes in handmade limited editions. Albert Moritz lives in Toronto, where he is serving as the city's 6th Poet Laureate. Albert has written more than 20 books of poetry, has received the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Award in Literature of the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, the Ingram Merrill Fellowship as well. His collection, The Sentinel, won the 2009 Griffin Poetry Prize, was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award, and was a Globe and Mail Top 100 Book of the Year. His most recent collections are The Sparrow and As Far as You Know. This is As Far as You Know, which has just been published in 2020. Well, last year, but with the pandemic, everything is new. Albert Moritz has translated many writers, including Gilberto Meza and Benjamin Péret, and of course, Ludwig Zeller. So I'm going to start with by asking Luciano whether he remembers. Luciano, do you remember when was the first time, or how you became acquainted with the work of Ludwig? And what were the circumstances that brought you to him and into his work?
Yeah, the person who introduced me to Ludwig's work was Giorgio De Chico, former Poet Laureate. And it was in the early 80s, 1982. Giorgio was really into Latin American poetry at the time. And we would have discussions about this. And he said, you should meet Ludwig. He actually lives in Toronto. He's a real Latin American poet, but we met you first. I think we met you at a reading that Giorgio may have given. And then, you actually then got involved with our circle. We used to hang out in the annex, and we had readings of our own, and we invited you to read. And
in fact, you organized my first reading. That's 1984,
right.
Yeah.
That's right. I think it was at the theater center. So we met you, and it was it was a while later that I actually met Ludwig. I believe it was at your home, and not much of a conversation between Ludwig and I, but a lot of communication nonetheless. That's the way it was, you know. And I met him a number of times over the years, even in Mexico when we went. But the minute I started to read his work, I found a voice that sort of I'd been looking for, that kind of broad, expansive voice that Ludwig had, and I became I read everything I could from that point on, and to this day it's still having an effect. We'll talk about that later, the kind of effect Ludwig's work can actually have on you. But yeah, so it started way back in '82, and it was through Giorgio and through you, I must say.
So, Luch, without more ado, I'm going to ask you to read a poem of your choice,
Okay.
which you think is particularly relevant to you or resonates in a specific way.
I could have chosen a million poems because it's a wealth of work that I admire. But the poem I picked to read is the title poem of this collection called "To Saw the Beloved to Pieces Only When Necessary."
Can you show the book?
Yeah. Can I see? Can we see it? You really can't see much, can you?
Get it closer. Yeah. There. Yes.
It's upside down.
No.
Anyways.
No, it's not.
Now I lost my page. Holy moly. Now I lost my page. Okay. So why I picked this piece is because it's a love poem, but all the images are violent. You ultimately arrive at love through images of horror and terror. I don't know, for some reason that seems to appeal to me, and maybe I have a perverse imagination. Certainly appealed to Ludwig, the idea that love can be expressed, you know, not just with butterflies and bees and honey, you know, but really getting into some deep, disturbing images, you can arrive at love. Anyways, I'm gonna read it, and hopefully the poem doesn't disturb the audience. The title's kind of funny when you think about it. To saw the beloved to pieces when necessary. Under the cutting edge of the knife, she feels how the moons circle above, creaking in the mirror. She thinks, she dreams, and listens how it grows in her body, stitch by stitch, that endless spiral of torture. They stare at her and wait lovingly, standing in the rain that deafens, the hand in the depth, clenched there, raises with its drag hook those tip of dream, and from the warm decay may fly away the exact butterfly. No longer is anything important, and under the burning gray, turning and turning, whirlwinds from a common center, I listen sometimes, and somebody is calling, shouting. I wake up and I see yet again the same image, the torturer and the wounds at one and the same time. I do not know if it is water that falls from above, if I will once more reach this globe that the wind drags along, if we will be able to pass through, or if the night is going to slam its pages together suddenly. Then I rise up, and without eyes, I can see the knife that somebody left behind. Clenched here in my hand, seeds of another sun. Those wheels revolving in memory, sawing my beloved into hosts for me.
Thank you so much, Luciano, who are not Acer.
I am not Acer.
So Al, I'm going to ask you the same thing, and hoping that you can. Well, I think you met Ludwig going way back, right? So I'll let you take that away.
Yeah, well, it was wonderful. And going way back, I think I met you as a result when you were, I believe, 11 or 12.
No, but
So I was doing some writing from 1977 through 1979 for the Old Books in Canada magazine, which was a very prominent magazine in those days. And whether they assigned it or I gave them the idea, I was asked to do a series or a longish article on prominent writers writing in Toronto, in Canada, in Toronto, in their own languages. For instance, one of the people I interviewed and said a few words about was Václav Iwaniuk of Poland. And so I got together some ones that I thought were good, and Ludwig was one I for sure put on the list. They didn't know about him, but I especially wanted to use this as an excuse to meet the great Ludwig Zeller. Well, I was very interested in surrealism, and Ludwig was known in international surrealism, but sort of secretly. He wasn't extremely prominent, but highly respected. And I knew he was in Canada. I think my main probably knowledge of him came in 1975 when the old Kayak Press, which was one of the great presses still existing at the tail end of the great counterculture literary boom of the 50s and 60s under George Hitchcock of blessed memory. It issued Woman in Dream in a translation by George Hitchcock himself and Fernando Alegria. And so I knew this tremendous poem in this wonderful but somewhat bizarre translation. And so in 1977, I rented a car and drove out to Trafalgar Road and visited Ludwig and Susanna and the kids, the three kids, the little kids, in their apartment. And I talked to Ludwig, and we just became fast friends. Teresa, my wife, had come out with me to do some translating, but we soon found that that really Susanna did all the translating, and Teresa could, of course, talk to the both of them in Spanish too. And so, so that was the beginning of the friendship. But what really cemented it, I think, is that it got known between us in our interview that Ludwig was working, that a lot of people already respected him, and he was working with Black Moss Press in Hamilton to bring out a large collection of his work in English. And so I managed to insert myself or get myself drafted into the effort, and I became an important part of the translation team in creating this large collection in English of Ludwig's work up through 1979 that came out in 1979, entitled by Ludwig Zeller in the Country of the Antipodes, making it clear to us that we in the North are the Antipodes. And so that was my to exhibit that, but Lucia's poem comes from that same period, and a version of it is included in that book, Ludwig Zeller in the Country of the Antipodes. So I'll read a poem of a different type, and one of the things that these Lucia's and the selection I was going to read and this selection here just brings back to me working with Ludwig and Susanna, and soon with Beatriz on later books. But they moved to Huron Street, right in town, catty corner from the Roberts Library on the edge of the U of T campus. And I was at that house all the time, and I would come in and they would share whatever food they had with me, and we'd then clear off the kitchen table and work for hours on this book. And I remember many a passage from this book along in that beautiful context, family context. This is called the Locket of the Bronte sisters. This is the locket the Bronte sisters owned. I found it there in the dust between the dry rails of the very station where they once waited for their impossible lover. Their dresses had so many petals that in admiring the pattern of the cloth, life passed. They smiled at each other, glancing sidelong like someone who bites at a hard, mysterious secret. Maybe none of it exists. Maybe I alone hold the keys, the leaves of that time, but I am mute before them, just as in childhood, and I don't understand why no one comes. No one will ever come.
That's an earlier poem, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
from the 1960s. Yes, it's
Yeah.
a wonderful poem. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about the influences of that, his work has exerted on us, or his person. I, for myself, I'm going to talk about his influence on me in the context of translation. What I wrote once about this, and it is this, that certain translations can enrich a literature to the point that it influences the literature for a long time, and it causes a kind of internal change. And such was the case of an early 20th century Chilean fiction writer by the name of Augusto del Mar, who translated a selection of the poems of a poet, also a mystic. He was a poet in the vein of the symbolists, but he was Lithuanian. He is the uncle of Czesław Miłosz. I see you have a book of his on your shelves there, Al. His name was Oscar de Lubisz Miłosz, and he wrote in French. The impact of Augusto del Mar's translation was so far-reaching that he marked really the poetry of two generations of poets, I would say. The precursors, the people who came before Ludwig. So you can see echoes of this, you can hear echoes of this poet in the poetry of Gabriela Mistral, or Pablo Neruda, and I have found specific examples of it. And this translation took immense liberties, and Del Mar worked with Miłosz and consulted with him, and Miłosz allowed him to, for example, in a specific poem, to take out an entire stanza at the end of the poem because it didn't feel like it worked in the Spanish translation. So the level of authorship that Del Mar took ended up being a book of immense echo. And in fact, Ludwig has had enormous respect and love for this book, for this poet, and he had a big collection of his work, and it was in fact the first book that he ever published. It's I have here a copy. I don't know, I can't see myself, so can you see it? It's a tiny little book that he published with his friend Sade, when they had a bookstore that of course went bankrupt because they didn't sell books. Everybody went to the bookstore to meet up, and he'd give the books away, so they went bankrupt very quickly. But that's sort of been the big lesson for me from Ludwig about the impact of translation and the repercussions on a kind of writing. And we mustn't forget that out of those generations, 2 Nobel Prizes came, both from Chile, Gabriela Mistral and Pablo Neruda. So I'm going to ask then, I'm going to ask you, Al, first. You've written about the influence of Romanticism, for example, on Ludwig's work, and Anna Balakian wrote very early about Ludwig's particular way of absorbing the surrealist dimension. How do you see it?
Well, that's a very important thing to me. I was holding this up. this is just for anybody's interest. This is a nice thick anthology in English of the works of Ovi de Lubitsch Miłosz, which Czesław Miłosz assembled back in the 80s or 90s, I think, called The Noble Traveler. So, you know, you can get some work, the life of writings of Ovi Oskar de Lubitsch Miłosz. So, yeah, I think that a kinship between me, as I'm a lover of the Romantics, I think when I really met Ludwig, I was acquiring German Romanticism. I knew something about it, yes, but I was deeply immersed in it then. And so that's the late 70s and the 80s. And so that was really important to me. And he not only knew a lot about it and had sort of nurtured himself on it when he was young, but he was clearly in a lot of ways an example of it. Still to be done is a real thorough translation of his first couple of books, which are highly romantic. You know, their originality, it would be to a certain extent finding a modern idiom for a romantic sensibility. And you can think of that as not unfamiliar, right? So you could think of great poets. Let's take an example like Eugenio Montale of Italy. Clearly in some of his longer poems is doing the ode of Friedrich Hölderlin for the 1950s or the 1940s. Many Italian poets would be working with some of the 19th century Italian poets, so on, and trying to do them, but in a modern way. Ludwig, it was unique among such mid-century great European language poets in really channeling, as we used to say, the fire and the agony of the Romantics. It's as I've often said, many people have often said, probably nothing important culturally has changed since the Romantic era. We've gotten used to it and bored with it. I guess we sometimes fall into believing the shtick that everything is more revolutionary all the time, when in fact it's just a dead repetition of the cliche of revolution that was created at that time. But the Romantics were anguished and exalted by the conflicts that were revealed at that time. And a job of the poet is to be a child, also to be a teenager who is first torn. And Ludwig could really do that. He could go back to being a romantic and speak from his, difficult, dream-centered and visionary symbolism, which you've already heard some of, and his strange volcanic melting torsions and confluences and meltings into one another of images. He could emerge from that, and because of that, with the full richness of it, into the plainest statement, that it's as if it comes in plain, modern, fiery language of absolutely today, clear and pure, yet from the heart of that moment of pain and aspiration 200 years ago. So that, and I don't understand why no one will ever come, right? Again and again, moments like that leap out in his poetry. So I saw, if you look across his life, it's got these 2 or 3 phases, I think. So this romantic phase was the primary or earliest one. Then he moved much closer towards surrealism, when he moved, I think in various ways, much closer towards pain. He was an active and obviously happy and well-connected person in the 50s and 60s in Santiago, but the cultural and political situation was getting worse and worse, you know, and finally he had to move, and then there was the question of exile and loneliness and so on. And he moved much closer to surrealism and really torn, fractured, burnt landscapes and some things that were imagery that was fully surrealistic and being completely anarchically associative and non-logical. He even at this time in his longer poems moved into a kind of Mallarmean syntax in which sentences would go on forever and the joints of them could flow both ways and the whole phrases could mean two or three different things at once, right? And then after that, the poet, in the third phase, the poetry quieted down in a sense to an almost kind of classical Spanish lyricism, retaining this basic romanticism and retaining this retaining a lot of the surrealism, but really the dreamlike associational parts of it, and not so much anymore the fractured language. So it's almost as if the terror became subject matter again, allowing his tonality to be gracious and human and hopeful, while still acknowledging as subject matter rather than anymore as the very substance of the poem, these threats, these tears, these threats of ruin and nothingness in existence, right?
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you. Yes. So Luciano, over to you, and then we can talk a little bit together among the three of us. What resonates particularly with you?
Okay, well, this is going to sound weird. Maybe it's just me, but the Catholic in me resonated when I first read Zeller's work. So what I see in it is a kind of collapsed and reversed Catholicism. Even the poem that I read earlier, I mean, he has his beloved being sawed into hosts, you know. So I mean, if you're writing in Spanish, I'm sure that the Catholic influence, the Catholic sensibility is in the language itself. And, you know, influences like, you know, St. John of the Cross. So in St. John, what you find is that, you know, here's a mystic who spends the bulk of his time talking about mortification, mortifying yourself, denying yourself, loathing yourself, torturing yourself to get to the point of salvation, to get to the point where you could unite with your beloved, with your God. So, you know, one leads to the other in St. John, but in Ludwig's work, they're simultaneous. The mortification and the union happen at the same time. That's what I mean by collapsed Catholicism. It's the ecstasy and the agony exist simultaneously, as opposed to one leading to the other. And also the paganism in his work is sort of a reversal of the Catholicism, a lot of classical references. And it's interesting that I don't know, I could be wrong about this, but surrealism, which seems to have taken root in Catholic countries, France and Spain, and thrived in Catholic countries like in South America. I don't think a lot of the northern Protestant countries are known for their surrealism. You know, it's the French, the Spanish, the Latin Americans. So I think there's a connection there. The Catholicism. I don't know what Ludwig's religious background was, and if he was, I don't know what religion he was raised with, if he was religious or not. But it's certainly there. So that's something that resonated with me because of my background. right?
You know
And
what's-
it's also in my work too, that kind of agony and ecstasy that comes from my Catholic heritage, I believe. So, you know, that's, I would say that's a strong influence that you guys didn't talk about, but I'm sure
But-
Al, you're aware that he probably loved St. John of the Cross, you know.
Well,
Yeah,
he was-
Light of the
absolutely.
soul.
Absolutely. I think, and you know, I think that that's really great. Also the absorbing Catholicism, English lovers of English literature are really, really familiar with this from many writers, but James Joyce, of course, right? Loving it and yet reacting against it and wanting to dispose of it by taking it all in and transforming it, right? I think that's very characteristic of him. And he was already building, I believe, on other Spanish writers who had done this, right? Like, I think he hid a lot of his influences very well. So a saint of my devotion is not just St. John of the Cross, but the great Spanish poet, Juan Ramon Jimenez, utterly different sort of poet from Ludwig. And yet it seems to me there's clear elements of influence, even down to wording, right? So Ludwig writes a central book called When the Animal Rises from the Deep, the Head Explodes, right? And so the beginning of that phrase is, Cuando el animal sube del fondo. Cuando el animal sube del fondo, when the animal rises from the deep. Well, Juan Ramon, just around 1950, had published a very great, one of the most famous books in Spanish poetry, in all history of Spanish poetry, whose title is Animal de Fondo, Animal of the Deep. Right?
Well,
So
Ludwig was
there's just one
extremely,
example, but Ludwig would steadfastly deny.
well, he was very well versed in the
Yeah.
Spanish classics.
Absolutely.
And I think part of what you're getting at, Luch, I've thought about this a lot. Why? I mean, there are many surrealist poets who are not Latin American or French or Spanish or and who write in English. But I think that the reason that there were essentially three surrealist groups in Latin America, in Argentina, Chile, and Mexico. They're like the three poles, right? The reason I think that there is this this impression that you get is because there is in Latin American and in Spanish poetry, there is the inheritance of the Baroque, the idea of excess, right? The idea that imagery is okay. You know, you go into Baroque churches in Mexico and they're full of stuff. And I mean, they're not sparse in decoration at all, right? So there is this, and Ludwig's poetry is imagistic. It's based on the image, right? And so I think that's a huge factor in his writing. And he was an incredible devotee of the Baroque poets like Francisco de Quevedo, who's not elaborate like that, like Góngora, but is from that period. You know, the two coexist, this kind of classicism and this kind of excess, right? This exuberance, right? And they, because they're really part of the same thing, really. But
can I stick a poem in here about this?
Yeah, why don't you do that? Yeah, and then, yeah, perfect.
It's a short one and it's quick, but it really illustrates what Luch is talking about. So I could just say quickly, Ludwig graduated from high school when only 15, and he went into a seminary, and he was preparing to be a Jesuit for 4 years until he just quickly decided to leave, and he went to Santiago instead and started being an artist.
He had a very hard time doing that. Yes.
So he arrives in Santiago at 19, having left this education. Well, he's remembering some of his education here in this poem. And it's one of his gracious poem. It's called A Maker of Infernos. And he dedicates it to one of his classmates. He says, religion class, room 3. There, Father Gregorio will explain to us, 40 rascals, the mechanisms of eternity. Consider, he says, the passing of time in hell. Once every century, a blue ant completes one trip around a bronze sphere as big as the earth. Slowly, step by step, it wears away that gleaming metal star. 10,000 myriads of footsteps fall, repeating themselves, and when it's done, only 1 second has passed in God's inferno of torments. He'd stop there, and we, chattering with stupor and fright, we'd beat our heads against the windows. Don Gregorio Martinez, Jesuit professor of rhetoric, is dead. The worms, as though they were ants, drag him away. Thank heaven that each of us rascals is now free to choose his own inferno.
Well, it's very illustrative, right? It explains everything, yeah. So Luciano, you got your answer, right?
There you go. Yeah. Great.
Now, Luciano, we're gonna turn over to you. You published a limited edition of a poem called The Snake. Well, it's a selection, right? It's called The Snake Eaters. Yeah, and tell us a little bit about how you got to publish that, or what happened around that, how that came about.
The Snake Eaters is a lyrical miracle book. It's a handmade book that I made. Only 20 copies exist. And it was, I think it came out of a conversation with you, Al. You said you had a number of poems, a small group of poems. Maybe they hadn't been published before. I'm not sure, but I know that, yeah, in the book that you published with us, these poems were republished. So this may have been the first time they were in a published form.
Yes.
We only wanted a small number of books. I think there was a special event. Was it Ludwig's birthday or something? I think it was connected to something. That's why it was a small run, and it was given out to Ludwig's friends. Actually, one of my students who had fallen in love with Ludwig's work approached him and said he would like to do the cover for this book. And in fact, the cover of the book is by a fellow named Felix Chakarov, a former student of mine. And Ludwig loved it, and I guess you approved of it too. And so it was an honor on my part to be able to do this, because two of poets I admire, Al and Ludwig, together in one shot. And I thought, I'm going to go for this.
Can you read a little bit from it?
Yeah. Now, the piece I'm going to read is very interesting. It's almost the exact opposite of the piece that I read earlier. This doesn't seem to have any surrealism in it at all. And it surprised me that Ludwig could go the other way completely and be very effective. This is a kind of a social justice piece. And every time I read it, it actually moves me. And oddly enough, one would think that because I'm a writer, that language could really get to my heart, but this piece in itself seemed to be more direct than a lot of the writing that I've read. This really gets to me every time I read it. It's called Coffee with Blood. Today I saw a child gazing at his misfortune. His tears have dried away. In his misery, he has only one eye left. He has no palms. They took the hands that might have covered his grieving face. Their gaff smashed the window. They burned his clock. I've seen his desolate gesture and would rather be someone else. It makes me ashamed to have hands and not be innocent, to have my fingers and move them, to use my eyes and never see bitter injustice like a plain hard thing, bitter and senseless. What can I give this child if a tear can never again flow back to the sea? I would like above all things to be God and give him back what they took, what belonged to him, his eyes and his hands, his innocence, and give him forgetting so he can see at last that destiny is the arabesque a bird draws at the will of the wind, the cyclone's wing. Maybe he could smile again. Today I saw this child and I don't understand why. How misfortune can ever strike this way, this deep, and pour so many miseries into a steel cup, stirring them to red heat, without sugar, coffee, and blood.
Yeah, he wrote that poem. That poem came about from, we used to get the Toronto Star, right?
Yeah.
And there was a picture of a child in the front page. It was the time of the war in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And the child had been injured in this horrific way, maimed in this horrific way. He was very moved by that, which is why, while you drink your coffee, you're looking at all this horror.
Right. But it struck me, it really came as a big surprise to find it in this collection, right? It just pops out. It's not a surrealistic piece. It's not, it's not submerged in the subconscious. It's not full of wild images, but it's just like a real heartfelt piece that goes to the core of what he has to say and how he felt. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think we have a little bit of time, so what I'm going to do is it's very moving. It's kind of hard to segue from that,
I'm sorry I read it.
No, it's a very important poem for him. It was very meaningful to him, so it's important. So what we're going to talk a little bit about is Ludwig's voice in English, which is you, Al. You've translated most of his work, I think all of it really, and you've retranslated much of whatever other people translated. So I'm going to ask you to read a little bit as you speak or illustrate your thoughts.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think that, as I was saying, I think his voice is unique. And if you're a translator, you want to be a poet in your own language, and you, just as in being a poet, you want to add something to your own language. In a way, you say you've got to be attracted to the poet. It's just, what I've said is just another way of saying you've got to be attracted to the poet. You yourself are trying to add something to your language. You see somebody else who would add something to the language. And so you want his voice to stay unique. It's often hard to understand. Well, that's a good thing about poetry. It's a good thing about speech. It makes us lean closer to each other, repeat and gradually move closer. And that's all we ever do. But I found that Ludwig's work helps me keep it unique just by being so different, so new. Even when you're tempted to say, I can't understand how these two sentences go together, these two phrases go together, or what this image means, and you're tempted to grope for what it means and thus write a translation that is really an explanation. He constantly pulls you back from that and makes you, with the solidity and the fieriness of his vision, stick to his wording. And I found in a way, the process for my translations, and I've gone through 4, 5, 6, sometimes different iterations of a poem, and as you say, based it on 2 or 3 other translations in English and other languages that, used them too. So it's gone through many changes. And what I've almost always felt is that the process is, starting with my original English version, bringing it back more and more to just simply reflecting the Spanish, right? Just not being worried that that's going to be too confusing or too odd or too strange in English, but just accepting it. So that's a part of what I've thought of. I thought that maybe I'd read a couple of poems to sort of maybe illustrate, you know, what we've already heard, some of the differences that he can bring out. So just some simple poems. This one is called Wealth to Count, and it's from his really from his surrealist phase, the beginning of the surrealist phase, one of those really early books in the 1960s, right around 1960 in Santiago. I dream that I am dreaming. I lean out on balconies, and it's the earth howling up there in the night sky. We are traveling by foot across mute scars on the moon, to a cackling of gorgons, the rulers here. What am I doing in this place? Why does my scream cut their throats? Blindly groping, they twist their heads. Clocks that leap broken to pieces on the ground. From each one, a thread winds into the skein of all knots, the blood. Years pass. She smiles, the talking head without body, the adored one who was my life. I want to force those walls at flame point, open those two legs, those cruel parting lips of the embers of salt, of boredom's metals. No water here. When I wake up, I see their boiling scales, scattered by a breath, but I can't see you. In other lights, feathers flow past like tongues. Your gaze is a caress of knives. To leave the labyrinth, to enter it, are one. Ontological distraction. Life is only a tube without remedy. Entering gives everyone the right to view the injustice, close it in his fist like a white hot ember and scream, tortured by its edges, or throw it like a burning spear into the cursed fabric the spider keeps weaving over the other entrance, which is a dream that life is only a tube without remedy. And this last one, a little longer, is called On the Kama Sutra. If a woman opens the sun, comes down the azure stair of her desires, enters a garden, and is in herself the mirror of 1,000 faces, a whirling seed that is multiplied, burns brilliantly and goes out, a cloud of fragrance scattered by the wind. If she is seen only in profile, her thighs and her arms driving forward while her hair falls quiet like a curved helmet over her neck, and perhaps unknowingly, her body repeats an inward image because real things are only reflections of what the river drags here from time's source. When she turns her back to the one watching her, undresses, is naked in the water with only jewelry of liquid pearl to cover her, and looks left and right holding her breath, and her body, consumed by a light breeze, becomes those flowers in flame that burn on the river. When all images are reunited in the central knot of her labyrinth, the sun no longer throws shadows on the bodies all the heat-enervated legs and shoulders in the marvelous sleep. Her breasts, erect for pleasure, become transparent and turn into what I dreamed, two doves in flight. Only her lips' freshness, the cool foam of her smile, clothe the curve of the sacred womb with their torrents and flow on until they reach a wild orchid sex. Slim hands for her light touches. She alone knows how to say the sweetness of the saffron milled in her bodies. Servant who carries her perfume, is that my fate? Azure water dimples under the wind's step. A snake hisses looped in the restless almond tree of desires, and freighted with petals, the river runs to its sea, pleasure undiscovered and denied. Open, you are love's lip, its eye without limits. Open.
Thanks so much, Al. That's a wonderful little sampling. Let's sort. We have a few minutes. I don't know if there are questions from people in our virtual audience. I don't even know how we would work this, but I guess you would unmute yourself and ask a question. Is there anybody
Unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself. Yeah. Well, if there isn't, I think what we could do is to conclude. But I wanted to say before that surrealism is not really a style. So it's true that Ludwig went through several phases. Of course, he went through a kind of curve, as every writer does, or every artist does. People evolve and change and whatnot. But it is he was always a surrealist. It's just that at a certain point, for many, many years, he experimented very, very intensely with language and with the expression of the dream world. I mean, he always considered the biggest body of work to be his dream notations, of which there are thousands of pages of dream notations that are unpublished. And in fact, Al translated a novella that he wrote that is based on dreams that he had. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know.
There is a way for them to ask questions through a chat box. So
yeah. So are there any questions in the chat box? I don't see any.
No.
No. So let me see. Why there has been not a presence of Zeller in French in Quebec? That's a really good question. There was a translation, a bilingual book, right, Al, that you worked on with Ecstasis, a French translation of Ludwig's long poem "Woman in Dream," right?
Yeah, well,
it was Jean-Antonin Billard who translated that book into French. Yes.
So there's some of his work exists in French. There's also a translation of Woman in Dream by Thérèse Dulac.
Well, there is When the Animal Rises from the Deep, the Head
and
of Earth is trilingual, right? Yeah.
That's trilingual, and there's translations of those 20 poems. But it's true, all of those are, it's what we say, to a certain extent, Ludwig was and remains a sort of poet's poet. Not as much as he was back up through 1980 or so, but a lot of these books are really precious objects that were published in small editions, and few people know about them. It's true.
Oh, it's not like he didn't want to be published in Quebec, but it's so hard to get published in Quebec. It's not just Ludwig. Most Anglo-Canadian writers have difficulty finding publishers in Quebec, especially for poets. There's hardly any publishing. I mean, I don't know that there is much. I don't know the publishing world in Quebec as well. But even in English, it's very difficult to find publishers at this time. So that would explain it, I think. Yeah, yeah. Are there any other questions? The discussion is so good. I mean, we don't have to go, but I don't. Susan is saying, thank you. I don't see any other questions. So, but nobody seems to be in a hurry. So I'm going to still end it there. I would like to thank Luciano Iacobelli and Albert Moritz and all of you who are here. And it's been a wonderful kind of small moment to share this with you. And I would much like to thank the Literary Translators Association for their support and their enthusiasm in beginning this series in this way. What a good way to launch Here is Elsewhere. So thank you and good night to everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.